It is day 23 of the government shutdown. We've got the latest. Also, Karine Jean-Pierre's roadmap for the Democrat Party, a number of interesting happenings on Capitol Hill, and so much more today on 10-Minute Drill.
Everybody get up, get up.
The story of America is the story of an adventure.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
It is day 23 of the government shutdown. One thing that we've talked about on 10-Minute Drill from the beginning is the longer this goes on, the worse it gets for Democrats. We're going to go over a tiny bit of polling that highlights that. But also, there's two parts to that. First, as people get to know how absurd the Democrats' shutdown demands are, they're going to have less support for them. But also, as more and more Democrats get on TV to try and explain their reasoning, they will put their feet in their mouths and create problems. Here's one of the top House Democrats.
Of course, there will be, families that are going to suffer. We take that responsibility very seriously, but it is one of the few leveraged times we have.
This is a classic quiet part out loud moment. Democrats admitting people are going to suffer, but they need people to suffer because it's a part of their political leverage. It also reminds me of this classic line.
Some of you may die, but it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
But the real bottom line here came out in a Hill article this week that showed exactly why Democrats are maintaining their shutdown posture. Democrat senators fear getting hammered after no kings for ending shutdown. People are going to get hammered if they vote for the House-passed bill to reopen the government and keep it funded through November 21st, said one Democratic senator who requested anonymity to talk candidly about their party. We would have enough votes to reopen the government if people were not terrified of getting the guillotine. Getting the guillotine. Yikes. But that is how Democrats currently feel about their base. I think it's notable that the Hill allowed a Democrat senator to speak on background, to speak without using their name, to describe how scared Democrats are of activists for coming after them. But they do have good reason. Let's rewind back 7 months. This is Time magazine on the Senate Democrats who helped Republicans avert a shutdown. You'll see front and center there, that's Chuck Schumer. You'll remember we've talked quite a bit about how Democrats led by Chuck Schumer have voted more than 13 times for this exact continuing resolution that would open the government right now. But in March, when Chuck Schumer voted to open the government and end the shutdown, he came under heavy fire. In that article from Time magazine, I think there is a deep sense of outrage and betrayal, Rep. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York told reporters at the retreat. And this is not just about progressive Democrats. This is across the board, the entire party. This is where the demands for a primary against Chuck Schumer really took off. It was so bad that even Hakeem Jeffries didn't want to stand by Chuck Schumer.
Have you lost confidence in him, the fact that you guys see this so differently?
Next question.
So the question for Democrats becomes, how long do they want to stick with this protect Chuck Schumer shutdown strategy, even if it comes back to hurt them? Here's John Fetterman, one of very few Democrats who have broken against their party to end the shutdown and open the federal government.
The guy that's going to consistently vote for country over party. I'm always going to vote for paying our military over the party.
While Democrats are doing this to please their very angry base, they're missing the fact that it's not helping them with the country at large. They continue to have one of the lowest approval ratings in history. Real Clear Politics average shows them currently at 34% approval, which again is among historic lows. While Republicans are not taking the shutdown hit Democrats want them to take. Republicans' approval rating on that same Real Clear Politics average is at 41. Meanwhile, President Trump also is not taking a hit from this shutdown, even though Democrats are doing everything they can to try and make it about him. Here's Harry Enton.
This shutdown hasn't eaten into Donald Trump's support at all. His net approval rating is actually up a point.
Last week, we talked about Abigail Spanberger's debate performance in Virginia. She currently is the Democrat candidate for governor in an election just a few weeks away. In the debate, she was faced with tough questions about Jay Jones, the attorney general candidate of the Democrats, who has said he wants to murder his political opponent and watch their children die. Spanberger's strategy in the debate was to look straight ahead and ignore questions, and it looked incredibly awkward and became a very effective campaign ad from the Republican in the race, Winsome Sears. The same strategy appears to be playing out in other interviews. Here's Abigail Spanberger again responding to questions about Jay Jones' texts.
The fact that I have to spend even a moment's time talking about somebody else's text messages from years ago rather than what I want to do as governor is something that I am deeply unhappy about.
Abigail Spanberger is unhappy that she has to answer questions about the fact that the person who she believes should be the top law enforcement officer in the Commonwealth of Virginia, Jay Jones, wants to murder political opponents and watch their children die. Again, this feels very similar to the debate strategy of treating these like they're not an issue. They are an issue. If you look at the polls for the AG race around Jay Jones, but also how that is impacting Spanberger's own poll standing, both of those have tightened incredibly. Abigail Spanberger did not expect to be just a couple points ahead at this point, but it is because she has failed to address Jay Jones and the fact that he wants to murder people and watch their children die. But that's not the only challenge for Spanberger. This week, she also, in an interview, addressed questions about her inability to give clear direction on her policy views on men in girls' bathrooms and in girls' sports.
The willingness to fearmonger with or against kids who are, trying to figure out who they are.
Spanberger wants you to believe this debate is just about young kids trying to figure out who they are. But here's the young kids this policy will actually impact. The reason this has become such a major issue in Virginia is this isn't about little kids who are confused. This is about convicted sex offenders who officials in Northern Virginia have allowed into locker rooms with girls. They have allowed this to happen, and Abigail Spanberger can't bring herself to say that's wrong. And so at the end of the day, as you consider what this means, this is the person that Abigail Spanberger believes your young daughter should have to change in front of. Later this morning, the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee is holding a hearing on a program called 340B. This is a drug discount program that has actually created major scandals around the country. For a little bit of background, the New York Times had a bombshell report a number of years ago about a hospital in Richmond owned by Bon Secours. How this worked is Richmond Community Hospital used a program intended to help lower-income patients get cheaper prescription drugs. Now, what happened is they got those drugs at a massive discount, but instead of giving them to patients at a discount or through their insurance at a discount, they charged the patients full price for this expensive drug and pocketed the difference and used the windfall they got from that to build additional facilities in wealthier parts of Richmond so they could make a ton of money off of it. And their poor patients got sent to collections and were chased down because they couldn't afford the drugs that were supposed to be sold to them at a discount. This is the 340B program. It has been abused around the country with other high-profile issues in places like Cleveland, Ohio. We've talked before here about Cleveland Clinic, the fact that they also get these drugs at a major discount, sell them back to patients or through their insurers at a full price, and use that windfall for some controversial things. Consumers Research reported the fact that Cleveland Clinic is operating a giant facility to trans kids. You can learn more about that and other similar abuses through their badmedicine.org page. Senator Bill Cassidy, the chairman of the Senate Health Committee, did a massive report on this that took years to compile about how hospital systems like Cleveland Clinic have made almost $1 billion in profit on this program. And instead of passing it on to poor patients or helping actually build up rural hospitals, things like that, they've used it for things like this facility to trans kids to perform sex change surgeries on minors, but also to build facilities around the world that help them generate more profits. That hearing later today should be very, very interesting. This week, the official comment period ends for something called the open banking rule. We've talked about that a little bit here. In President Trump's first term, he began the process of writing a rule that would allow you to share your banking information between your bank and tools that you want to use like Venmo, PayPal, things like that. In order to connect your bank, your account that has all your money in it, to all these different financial technology tools, also things like crypto, there are data rules for how that has to happen. He began that process of writing that rule. It was finalized under President Biden, but the big banks hated it because they don't want people to use tools like Venmo, PayPal, things like that. They want you to use the tools they build themselves so that they can control your data, get transaction fees and things like that. So they sued over this rule and it became a very big legal fight. President Trump just a few months ago, through the CFPB, began a process of rewriting the rules that would set exactly how that is done. This from Punchbowl. It's everybody versus the banks on financial data rights. On one side of this, you have the big banks that want to control as much as they can. The Trump administration, and President Trump in particular, and his son Eric, have very strong feelings about these banks.
And they wanted to see us broken. They wanted to see us bankrupt. And now, in turn, we won that battle. The battle I'd like to win against the big banks is I'd like to see them gone in such a big way. I would like to see them totally irrelevant.
Here's President Trump specifically calling out JP Morgan Chase.
Well, they did discriminate. I had JP Morgan Chase. I had hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. They told me, I'm sorry, sir, we can't have you. You have 20 days to get out.
What both Eric and President Trump are talking about is in the wake of January 6th, JP Morgan Chase froze their accounts as Democrats in Congress were doing everything they could to try and silo President Trump and take everything they could from him and began the very big lawfare campaign. The banks joined in and froze their accounts. But it wasn't just the Trumps. Religious liberty organizations, gun manufacturers have all been targeted by the banks for very, very political purposes. Now those same banks are trying to demand control over how people use their data to connect to apps, things that they like. Personally, I love things like budgeting apps where I can connect my bank account to tell me how much to spend on certain things. Families use things like Venmo to, transfer a little bit of money to their son off at college, whatever it might be, but also crypto, Coinbase, things like that. So this week ends the period for people to give comments in this process about how they believe this rule should be written. Here's Wyoming Senator Cynthia Lummis. Large banks have shown they'll restrict access for political reasons, targeting industries and individuals they disagree with, including gun manufacturers, digital assets, churches, and even President Trump. I sent a letter to the CFPB expressing my strong support for the open banking rule. Senator Lummis's letter focuses on specific reasons the people of Wyoming need access to open banking in these financial innovations, particularly if you live in a place where you're very far from your brick and mortar bank or don't necessarily have the ability to pay somebody for a service in cash, check, things like that. But also, Wyoming is heavily involved in the advancement of digital currencies and crypto. So this will be a very, very interesting process to watch play out. But again, as that headline said, it is the banks versus everybody. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of attention on higher education being largely captured by the political left. It impacts things like faculty, silencing debate, what kind of protests are allowed to happen, what kind of speakers are allowed to speak to students. City Journal has released a new college ranking system that takes some of those major issues into account. They evaluate schools based on things like educational experience, faculty ideology, student perception of faculty ideology, faculty teaching quality, speech climate, commitment to meritocracy over factors like DEI and racial quotas, the quality of the alumni network, value added to your career, student experience, student free speech, political tolerance. Here's Chris Rufo explaining why this is so important.
We've taken 100 institutions and we've given them scores not just on prestige or testing or career outcome.
These should be a valuable tool for parents as they evaluate the holistic college experience. For our You Can't Make It Up segment today, we go back to Karine Jean-Pierre. She's on a book tour to talk about her book about becoming an independent. And in one interview, she got into a very interesting back and forth.
He didn't do either. He didn't talk very often, and when he did, it wasn't very good.
Yeah,
he sounded very
maybe
old.
Maybe we weren't paying attention to what we were doing at the White House. But
I paid attention. I'm with you on the policies. I'm talking about his performance.
The president spoke to the American people a couple times a week. He traveled and did domestic travel and talked directly to the American people.
What presidency was she watching? She was the press secretary. Her role was to give us all honest, clear information about Joe Biden. We already know that ship sailed. But for her to come back all this time later, after we've had congressional hearings and testimony about Joe Biden's vacancy, for her to say, actually, he did as much media as Donald Trump. He was out there. People saw him multiple times a week. We saw him multiple times a week on a beach asleep under an umbrella. And so this is very absurd. It's also important to note the person she's arguing with is a huge Biden supporter, but he's being pretty clear in saying, we didn't see him. He didn't do a good job of communicating. What is wrong with you? So this as a backdrop, I wanted to get into the things that she talked about with Stephen Colbert.
Right now, in this moment, which is why I actually wrote the book, to give people a roadmap, I don't think there's any teeth. There's no fight. Where's the soul?
As you hear those people clap for Karine Jean-Pierre saying, one, she wants to create a roadmap. Two, there isn't any teeth, there isn't any soul. The lack of self-awareness for her as the spokesman for Joe Biden. First, does anybody want to hear about a roadmap from the Baghdad Bob character who was the face of Joe Biden driving the party to their lowest approval rating in history? Is she the right person to give that roadmap? Two, there's not any teeth, not any life. She was the face of the administration that was vacant, the Otto Penn administration.
We're all trying to find the guy who did this.
I think that's shocking, but that's politics, baby. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us here on 10 Minute Drill. Please like, subscribe, tell your friends, leave us a review. Have a great day.